Good evening, everyone, and welcome to nuestro programa, today's show of Critica NYC. And you can join us on our website, Critica NYC. My name is Lucia Gomez, and I'm your host tonight at Critica NYC. And our co-host, Raquel Batista, is currently on vacation, so we really want to make sure that she's having a great time. So, Raquel, don't worry, we're having the show tonight. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Eli Valentin. He is a political analyst and a writer for Gotham Gazette and so many other things, Eli. So welcome.
Thank you, Lucia. Such a pleasure being here with you.
Always. So much to talk about. I know I named and coined the show, shaping our future as a community. And I know that we always have so many great at-length conversations that I felt like perhaps there was a need to open this dialogue up, kind of have this conversation amongst the masses of whoever watches the show, and invite folks to really start thinking critically about where we are as Latino community in the city of New York, the state of New York, and in the nation, as so many things are happening throughout the country. I wish I could have a conversation about so many of the policy and legal decisions that have come down, but at a certain point, all of that gets me really sick to my stomach. So I have to admit that while we're talking about shaping our future as if we have so much control over it, there's so many external realities and decisions that are kind of being made on our behalf to shape our communities. And the ones that I want to talk about tonight are really the ones that we can have some control over. We definitely can have control of some of the decisions, pre-decisions made by the courts when we make the appointments to the courts. But those are so big that nobody really understands, Eli, like how this happens, right? And it's sort of like it happens for us. So to start up our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about what took place in these last primaries, right? And what the discourse is post-primary, right? The primary that just took place last week on June 28th was the both Democratic and Republican primaries. The ones that were supposed to be held were only held for the statewides, for some of the court, right? The judicial type of decision of elections, as well as the state assembly races. The two races that are still left are the federal congressional races, as well as a Senate race, right? That will happen. That didn't happen, right? Did that just happen as well? Schumer's race? He didn't have one. He didn't have a challenger. Oh, okay, great. So we're going to have congressionals and state Senate in the coming weeks. So let's have a conversation first about, what brought us to this primary, who brought us to this primary, what took place, and what the impacts are, let's say, for the August primary, right, which we weren't expecting a second party primary to take place, and then essentially the November elections. So what happened last week?
Well, I think the first thing is the lower turnout that we saw this year, at least compared to other years, especially the last gubernatorial primary, which saw the first spike in turnout that we had seen in some time. This time around, I have to say the turnout was pretty low across the city, especially, and that meant seeing a lower turnout in Latino majority districts across the city as well. So I think the first thing is how just the level of voting that we will hope to see. We're not seeing it. At least we didn't see it this year. So that's the first thing, right? And the second thing is, I think that at least when it comes to to Latino politics in New York, we are seeing a shift from a Puerto Rican dominated type of political representation to a more broader political representation among Latinos, right? So, we could talk about the Bronx, Jose Rivera, a long-standing Puerto Rican elected official, right? First elected 40 years ago, and he lost to a Dominican candidate, George Alvarez, in the Bronx. But we could also speak about in Queens, which is not spoken about enough. We saw the first Colombian judicial candidate get elected in the borough of Queens. And if I'm not mistaken, her name is Maria Gonzalez, the first Colombian judge elected in the history of the state of New York. That has not been spoken about.
In the courts,
judicial candidate. So she made history. She was she contended against the county back candidate. So that's another thing to talk about, Lucia, how the Queens Democratic Party has lost several of their judicial endorsed candidates in Queens. They have lost to people of color. So several years ago, Lumari Maldonado Cruz won against a county back candidate. Last year, Soma Fayed, Bangladeshi born, she won. She beat a county back candidate. And now we have Maria Gonzalez, a Colombian born candidate, win. So there were some surprises. I think, and in this situation in Queens, a good surprise happened. But I think we got to go back to this turnout issue, especially as it relates to Latinos and the fact that our people are not voting in the numbers that we hope them to.
I mean, I think it's critical to highlight Juan Ardila, right? Also,
yes.
Colombiano, I believe, right? Is he Colombian?
Yeah, I think he's half Colombiano. I'm not sure if he's half Puerto Rican. For some reason, I think he's half Puerto Rican.
Yeah, I mean, Juan Ardila, who ran last year in District 30 against incumbent Bob Holden, came pretty close, to that candidate when he ran in city council. Then in open seat, an opportunity came up because Assemblywoman Kathy Nolan, who had been in that seat for years, decided not to run. Her endorsed candidate, which, Joanna Carmona, also the county endorsed candidate, did not win. Juan Ardila, she actually came in third place, a Latina candidate, I think Puerto Rican woman, if I'm not mistaken. And but Juan Ardila, captures the win in that district. And so, we have a couple of new folks. Jorge Alvarez did beat Jose Rivera in the 78th Bronx Assembly District. But let's talk a little bit, Eli, about this turnout issue, right? For starters, folks should know that, New York State, our conversations are usually about the primaries in New York City. Unlike Long Island or upstate, and I had to explain this earlier today, our elections amongst Democrats, right? Who's the best Democrat to represent you in the assembly? We control the House in the assembly, right? We control the state assembly, and we control the state Senate as Democratic Party. But, our communities, run the gamut. Majority of our communities are Democrat or unaffiliated. In other parts of the state, we could have, many more Republicans, let's say, in other parts of the state, whether it's Long Island, Nassau, Suffolk, or upstate. But in the city, our fights are always amongst Democrats, right? Amongst who is the best Democrat to represent. So I think it's critical for folks to understand that while you can turn out in every November election, your real hard choices and your races that are really extremely important to make the choice as to who will get elected is really during the primaries. And we see that the primary turnout amongst Latinos and amongst everyone, but Latinos, I'm sure, when we've seen this in the African American community as well, and people of color community, is much lower because essentially how, and we can talk about why it's lower, but how they get the information, right? Where our communities are seeing or understanding the importance of a primary versus the typical general elections in November, which is where all the magic happens for presidential national elections, right? So for starters, primaries, and folks need to understand this, are critical if you live in New York City. Critical. Your turnout can make a huge difference as to who wins in November, because essentially after you win the primary, your November challenger, which is either a Democrat or Republican, in most cases we're talking about a solid Democratic win over a challenger in the Republican Party, because the enrollments are so high on the Dem side. It doesn't mean that you can't cross over and vote into another party, but typically that does not happen in New York City. We don't see that often. We don't see that. So just to highlight, we're talking right now about there was just a June 28th primary that the governor was up, the lieutenant governor, and we had assembly races and the judicial candidates, right? They were all up, as well as some district leader races in certain parts of the city. And the turnout was horrendous, right? First woman elected in the primary, going into for the Democratic Party, going into become the first woman governor. I think we had another candidate, right? A female governor in the past in the primary. But in this scenario, we're talking about, electing, and this was a bunch of choices people have. Why do you think people stayed home, Eli?
That's the critical question. I'm wondering how much there is a voter fatigue. I wonder if voter fatigue is one. I'm wondering if disenchantment on the part of voters is another, especially considering that we're living in such challenging times, right? And this is aside from the whole pandemic, which is a challenge in itself, but couple that with the economic challenges that we're facing, and there's the crime issue, the quality of life issue that is hitting New York, pretty sharply. And I think that all these have contributed to a kind of disenchantment with the entire political process, and perhaps especially towards political leaders that may be receiving the brunt of this. But I think it says something about how voters may feel about what is happening, and someone has to receive the blame. And I think that perhaps that may be something that should be explored and studied. And by the way, I think the August primaries will also show a lower turnout, and I'm wondering how the November election will be. And if we see in November a lower turnout than we did, for instance, in 2018, then I think it says something about the situation in which we're living in, and the fact that voters may be feeling really disenchanted with the entire political process, which is perhaps justifiable on many reasons, but also I think disconcerting. Really, I'm afraid about what that may mean when we already experience low turnout, right? And if we have a divorce of from people when it comes to civic and electoral participation, then I fear a little bit about our future, So
isn't it interesting, right, that folks perhaps retrieve from engaging because they're just like, oh, this is the same BS, right? Same old, nothing's ever going to change, but nothing will change because the folks are staying home.
Right.
And, there's so many sayings around, the squeaky wheel, right, gets the oil, right? What are all those sayings that we talk about? And yet somehow folks don't manage to grasp that this translates into the issues that elected officials tend to carry and champion and be about. If you leave me to my own devices and as an elected or as just a person to go on my merry way on the things that make me happy, I probably would be doing 20 other things than the ones that I am working on behalf of, the ones that I feel responsible for, the ones that I get calls about, the issues that come to my purview for me to pay attention to. If these things are not always in my face and I'm surrounding myself by these things all the time, then I'm going to focus on La La Land. I would be doing, just chilling in a beach somewhere, right? Not worrying about anything in the world. But that's not the case. And so if there's an election coming and folks stay home, then it just feels counterproductive to the very disenchantment that they have. It kind of feels like that's going to continue to take place, right? Like logically, I can see an elected not addressing the issues of the majority because the folks that are turning out are of a very minute segment of the population. And most of the time, geographically situated in parts of the city, they may not be feeling the majority of the concerns that you kind of, spoke about, right? In terms of quality of life and in terms of, crime. And perhaps not, I'm just curious if all these things, have something to do with one another and how they kind of coalesce.
Yeah. By the way, and this just as you were talking, this came to mind. I'm curious. I'm wondering what your take is on this, but you mentioned you just mentioned, right, the minuscule number of people that vote, and it's a small percentage of voters that end up deciding who our elected representatives are, right? And that's a fact. That's just a reality. There are some that have called for like nonpartisan elections, and therefore getting others more involved in the political process early on. So, to kind of I guess alleviate that situation. So I'm curious, do you think that nonpartisan elections is an answer? Do we open up the primary system and make it an open primary instead of a closed primary system, which we have now? In other words, right? So if it's a Democratic primary, only Democrats can vote, right? So somewhere like how do we
listen? You're making me laugh because I'm thinking, which hat am I going to wear? Am I going to wear the Lucia wants everyone to exercise their right to vote? And if that's the hat that I'm wearing, then I'm like, absolutely, you make it an open, right? If you're talking about Lucia who can run a campaign and the least amount of turnout will allow me to run a successful outing of a sitting person who's not addressing everyone's issues, then I'm saying, no, leave that closed, because now it requires me to use a little less money to focus my power on, right, on a small segment of that population. Or turnout, which is one thing that I love to do, is I usually go after those voters that don't have great turnout, that no one's talking to, that are not being sent 3, 4, 8 pieces of mail because they're not your prime voters, and engage those individuals for about 3 to 4 months before an election, right? Like, that's my strategy. I love that, because there are a lot of people that are home that didn't even know there was a primary that just took place. They didn't get the hundreds of mails from the 100 mail pieces from the different consultants and the different independent expenditures that were launched at certain candidates or against certain candidates. Folks that understand that your name is on a voter list. Mm-hmm. We know if you vote or did not vote. Right. Everyone knows. That buys into being able to purchase these voter lists because it's public information. You're exercising your right to vote. It's public information. Right. So everyone knows if you voted, you didn't vote in the last couple of years, right? your voter history is made public. I don't think people understand how critical and how public your vote really is.
Yeah.
And if it was an open primary, then absolutely, I think that it won't be about the party system anymore, or the lack of the party system, or the county. And when you talk about county, I think it's important folks to recognize that the county, the Democratic Party of a given county in the state of New York, in the city of New York, as well as, the Republican Party, there are chairs and there are people who run the party based on party membership. So if you're part of the Democratic Party, you probably elected a committee person, right, who represents you within the party infrastructure, a state committee person, right? And I think it's critical for folks or district leaders, right, within, their jurisdictions of the state assembly geography. That system, if eliminated, would not have such a strong party influence over the candidates. Unlike states like New Jersey, where the party influence is huge and it's currently being challenged right now in the courts and it's going to be heard soon. New York City, while, your positioning on the ballot is not managed, it's kind of random, supposedly, right? Like, it's a lottery. So your position within the ballot has nothing to do with your county endorsement, whereas like in New Jersey, your county endorsement will position you on the ballot in a way that nobody knows how to vote the other way, right, for anyone else. But if you're unaffiliated, you really don't have many choices in New York City.
Right.
And a lot of people think that they're, I'm not at any party. Okay, well, that means you make no choices on the candidates when November comes. You're either with that candidate or you're against that candidate. And not many candidates, the Republican Party hasn't necessarily put out many Republican challengers, especially in heavy Democratic seats. And so the choices are even more limited coming to the general election. But I think, Eli, it's very interesting that you raised that as a possibility, because I think, other states do it. I know that I was just, a part of a friend of mine was running for the Manassas City Council, tiny, town in Virginia, for the Manassas City Council. She won, top vote getter. It was 29,000 votes.
Wow.
Like, think about this. I'm saying tiny. Wow. It was a citywide race, but she got 29,000 votes. Some of these assembly seats representing in the state assembly got 3,000 votes.
Yeah.
Total.
Yeah.
If that.
Yeah.
Some of them got 1,000 something in a total of 3,000 people who turned out to vote in the city of New York.
In the city of New York.
A district which is 134,000 total people, voters or electorate are at least what, 80,000?
Just about.
So isn't that like, that's really sad, folks. I mean, if anything, that also gets me sick to my stomach, but not the same as the fact that policies that get championed, money that gets trickled down to these neighborhoods and projects that are perhaps initiated by the person you send to Albany or the person that you elect, for your community, won't see the light of day, or, just some of the wrong issues, not really addressing the district that they live in, are the ones that are going to be heard. Now, on the nonpartisan piece, I'm curious, right? This also would require these same electeds that we have now elected in the primary that will win essentially or be challenged in November, have to now go to Albany to say, yes, please, even though I only had to win by 1,000 votes or less, I now want there to be, open primaries. How do you think that plays out? Because we still don't even have campaign finance for state candidates, right? Like money provided to the candidates so that you have more races, essentially typical to, similar to what we saw in the city council last year. Not sure, Eli. I mean, aside from what my opinion could be on the, open process piece, do you think that can remedy? Have you seen it? Have you heard of it remedying raising turnout in other places?
Not so much, at least not astronomically, right? There are other major cities that have nonpartisan elections. By the way, we have them in the city of New York, but only when it comes to special elections for city council, for instance, right? Those tend to be not tend to those are nonpartisan elections. So I guess we have a form of that, but there's no way to measure whether that will make an impact or not, because special elections has even less turnout than a primary, right? So it's really hard to measure. But there are other major cities that have it. Studies have shown that it has not drastically improved turnout. So really, I don't know if that is necessarily a solution to the problem. I think the solution may entail a number of things, right? Who knows? Will same-day registration do it? Will lifting some of the deadlines for registering before a primary or changing parties before primary, so that so you don't have to do it so far in advance before a primary as it is now. Who knows? I mean, there are a lot of options on the table. I just don't think there's one silver bullet, right?
Right.
I think it's a number of things, but I think that at the root of it is a kind of distrust on the part of voters when it comes to our political system itself, right? And I think that may be at the root of it. I think everything else is kind of like maybe putting band-aids on a deeper issue. So I think again it's a combination of things. For me, I'm like, listen, I think as many band-aids as possible as we can put on this, let's talk about it, put it on the table, because I do think that the more people participate in our process, the better it is. Although
we did see 2018, right? See an increase in voter turnout.
Yeah.
Now, this had a lot to do with tons of resources put in and agitation of the fact that there wasn't what they call the independent. What is it? The IRC? What the IDC?
Oh, the IDC.
The IDC, the Independent Democrats, right, that were caucusing with the Republicans. And at a certain point, it energized the inner base of the Democratic Party to say, why are we allowing ourselves to be dictated by a very rogue group of individuals that were elected to be Democrats, but choose to caucus with the Republicans? And that somehow energized people. And there was huge amounts of turnout. I can't tell you whether or not there was lots of turnout amongst Black and brown folks, right? But there was overall large turnout in the city. There were some major challenges. I would say that not every assembly district in the city was challenged, right? And the fact that we have 2 primaries this year because of redistricting and because of the fact that the courts intervened late on the the redrawing of the state Senate and congressional lines. We saw the need to host then 2 primaries, and there was no desire by either party to make 1 primary in August, because the reality is that if there's low turnout, that always benefits the incumbent. Yeah. Low turnout of your solid group of supporters who know your name and who are able to remember your name at the ballot box will always benefit an incumbent.
Yeah.
So let's not get it twisted. This is also strategic, right? To leave it there. They could have changed the primary to August, but nobody wanted to allow a person who had less name recognition to gain traction and really have a strong showing in an August primary, where you would see congressional districts potentially. We do have some congressional districts being challenged. We have Senate districts that are going to see some challenges. couple that with some of the assembly races and the gubernatorial race, then potentially we could have had greater turnout.
Yes.
Right. So this year essentially is a little bit is definitely an anomaly, right, because we have two separate primaries. But in the past, we saw congressional primaries in June while having the legislative primaries in September. But the turnout this time around was definitely one of the worst that we've seen in a very long time.
Yes.
All right. So now we have August primaries, Eli. What can we be looking forward to there?
Looking forward to?
Yes. Like, you know, I mean, at a minimum, folks should know, right? They're August 23rd, right? They're happening in the ends of our vacation period, but not the end, third week into August, where school's still out, right? So you can't get to parents the way the September primaries used to get to parents and reminding them and school starting and that, you know, people are back feel. People may not be back. People are still not back, right, you know, kind of from the pandemic. So are there any races that we should be looking out for and that people should be made aware of, you know, that have real challenges?
Yeah, there's several. And hopefully that means, you know, the action there will bump up turnout, right? At least in those areas. But there's several in, as you know, congressional races that are really heavily contested. One of them is the Carolyn Maloney and
Jerry Nadler
race, right? So it puts District 12. So it puts two incumbents running in one district, right? So that's going to be interesting. It's heating up. It will continue to be that way. Then there's the 10th congressional, which, you know, we'll see Bill de Blasio, the former mayor, running. I mean, I don't know who's
Councilwoman Carlina Rivera, Latina running in that seat. Yep.
Absolutely. I don't know who is not running in that district, Lucia.
A lot of kids.
Right? You have so many. Mondaire Jones, you name it, right? Daniel Goldman. So that's going to be one to watch, right? That's going to be highly contested. And then you have some Senate races that will also be heated. In the Bronx, Gustavo Rivera has a strong challenge from Miguelina Carmona, I think is her name. Camilo, thank you. And she's been endorsed by the Bronx Democratic Party, Congressman Espaillat. And then obviously Gustavo Rivera is the incumbent there. And, you know, so I think that's going to be one. Robert Jackson's district, you know, which is west of that going into Manhattan. That's
Senate District 31,
yes.
Who saw a major change in their lines, right?
Huge,
it's definitely become from 48% Latino, now huge jump to about 65%, which means that, you know, many more Latinos to kind of have to move, right? Leaves the Upper West Side. You know, typically that district originally had run all the way down to Chelsea alongside, you know, very high voter turnout areas that favored Robert Jackson. Now, though, you know, that district is cut at 155th Street and now enters the Bronx again, but this time mimicking Congressional District 13 through 207th Street. I mean, I know this district, right? University Heights and Kingsbridge. So definitely a very different district, a challenge for a sitting Senator Robert Jackson, who essentially became a senator after beating, you know, a Dominican senator, Senadora, you know, Marisol Alcántara, right? So definitely, I would say kind of the Bronx, a place to watch, Senate District 34, you know, where Natalia Fernandez is running in a redrawn Senate District 4. She's currently the Assemblywoman. Who didn't have a challenger in this past primary, but thanks to the bifurcated primaries, she can keep her assembly seat if she doesn't win the state Senate. And, you know, that's in the old Biaggi seat. So that district goes barely a little bit into Westchester, parts of New Rochelle. But definitely, you know, I would say the northern parts of the city, huge activity. Southern parts of the city on the congressional end, lots of activity. But we also have a Latina, Kristen Gonzalez, running in the brand new Senate District 59, which takes up Long Island City and parts of Stuytown, right? So there's a lot of activity in that Senate district. Are there more Latinos aside from our sitting incumbents that are running in other parts of the city?
No, not that. Yeah, because
Angel Vasquez is the one running against Robert Jackson in Senate District 31,
yes.
right? Yeah, I gotta think. I don't think there is. I mean, that essentially means that our communities are either going to get energized and turn out to vote for their favorite Democrat in the August 23rd elections, or stay home and allow the incumbents and allow essentially whatever, it's sort of like becomes a popularity contest. Who can pull the most people from their inner circles to turn out? And in some instances, that means a couple of hundred people can make the decision for Senate districts that are 300 and something thousand. I believe it's like 311,000 people in a Senate district. So yeah, a lot at stake.
A lot at stake,
folks. So we have some open seats. I'm sure the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, that's going to be like fire. August 23rd, I don't know if people, are vacationing, with greater means in some of these areas, but definitely a lot to watch. Now, all of this adds up, and a lot of things that have been thrown out, right? You talked about quality of life concerns. You talked about crime. We had the overturning of, concealed weapons, right? Now allowing anyone to be able to carry. And I believe there were some, the legislature was brought back into Albany to help shut that down a little bit by eliminating some places where that will no longer be legal for them to carry in certain places. But essentially, whoever gets elected will be able to voice some concerns around crime, right? And how to address those, how to address the issues of quality of life in the state, and sometimes as specific to the city as possible without overstepping their bounds, right? In terms of quality of life, things that only the city electeds can participate. That leads me to the fact that we're currently in the redrawing of the New York City Council districts. Now, folks, if the state was a mess, and we saw already what having the courts get involved to redraw the districts are like, I want to highly encourage folks to not let the same happen in the city, right? You have a redistricting commission in the city of New York that now has to redraw 51 council seats for the 8 million people that live in the city of New York, that can really make a difference in who represents you on quality of life issues, on crime in the city of New York at the city council level. And after those districts are redrawn, 2023, we will see a new race just after 2 years where the majority of the council got elected, brand new city council, group of brand new people. You'll have your second chance at either electing those incumbents in districts that could be brand new, or essentially, looking for candidates after the districting process, kicks in. So, Eli, what is your, what can you tell the common person that doesn't know anything of what I just said, right? How would you explain the redrawing for the city? How can people relate and understand the impact that redrawing the lines will have on quality of life for the next couple of years in the city?
On quality of life, and even in terms of representation itself, right? I mean, who knows? Hopefully not. And you know this much better than I do. So I think I'm going to ask you questions so you can enlighten our viewers. But even in terms of representation, right? Are there areas that could hamper certain ethnic groups, right? Where they're lumped into a district where other groups may outnumber them, right? So there's a lot at stake when it comes to redistricting issues. because it impacts so much, and even at the level of representation. So it's definitely important that people get informed about what is involved, and even how to get involved. And Lucia, I know you've been at the forefront of redistricting issues for, this is probably what, your third cycle, right, that you deal with these issues. So I mean, I think you're the perfect person that can enlighten so many about the process itself. So and, being at the forefront, I'm wondering what you would suggest are, some of the things that people should, how can people get not only informed, but also how can or should they get involved in this process?
That's a great, thank you for that, Eli. I mean, what's funny is that I don't think people understand that for those of us involved in politics, I get amped up every 10 years, because I know that every 10 years I have a second shot at being able to reimagine what a district can look like. Because throughout the decade, I've seen people's voices not be heard because there's not enough of them. I can't draw people in, right? Or I can't make people up. But I know that if, 155th Street, that boundary line is really a fake boundary line, because people who live on 155th have started to move south to 145th, and then cross that boundary in the last decade to 135th and call that home. And they're all part of the same nucleus of hardworking people that had to move around and shift and call new spaces community, because housing stock has changed, job opportunities have changed, or new train lines have been created or shut down, right? Folks gravitate to the ease of facility for work, school, right? And, transportation. These are the ways people find economic relief, is by where they move to find cheaper housing or opportunities, or where they can use their vouchers, or where there's apartments actually available. And so what we have seen in the last decade is a shift in population, where Latinos essentially have chosen to move into spaces, whether it's the purchasing of, let's say the purchasing of an apartment, or houses where other communities have now moved out, because we have seen essentially, definitely non-Latinos leaving the state of New York and leaving the city of New York, whereas Latinos haven't decreased in population. They've grown over 156,000 people. And the Asian community has, increased double that, around 300,000 people. So we do know that Latinos aren't leaving the city, but we now have to figure out a way of capturing, where it is that they live. And so with that, I think, I'm going to share my screen so that folks can view a little bit of where they can actually be in the city. I think you can see my map. Is that right?
Not yet. Oh, there you go. But by the way, Lucia, just a quick point. And this is why this is so important. People need to realize the ramifications of this. However lines are drawn, this is for a whole decade, right? So this is not something that's going to change as a result of an election, right? This is something that will be with, someone where they'll be drawn into a district for the next decade. So this is huge, right? People need to realize how huge it is. I'm sorry, I just had to point that out as you show your beautiful maps.
Yeah, no, and these maps are not mine. Folks can absolutely, view these same maps on New York City, nyc.redistrictingnu.org. This is a set of maps that were created by CUNY and their amazing mapping service system, and their entire team there. And, what I just did under legend here is change so that I can see now the pretty colors and put the voting age Latino origin based on the census data. And, something that you said is interesting in terms of representation. Latinos currently have, all the green is where Latinos live based on the 2000 census, right? So folks can see, along the border of Brooklyn and the southern border of Queens along the Brooklyn border. You can see, the North Shore of Staten Island. You can see Sunset Park here, if I zoom in, right? Sunset Park, Red Hook, Lower East Side, right? You can see Chelsea area along the West Side Highway, El Barrio. You can see Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, right? Inwood, all of the Bronx. Bronx is one of the densest Latino boroughs in the city with over 50% Latino. It has been in quite some time. And this particular map shows council districts. Now, one of the most dense council districts in the city is Council District 21. And in this council seat, which is currently represented by Council Member Moya, on the left-hand side, you see, right, Francisco Moya. And here you see the total population there, the voting age population, the non-citizen voting age population, right? So the non-citizen population is about 30% of the district. But this district, and if you hover just over the green, covers 73% Latino in this district. Now we're talking about Corona, right? We're talking of parts of Elmhurst and Jackson Heights and parts of East Elmhurst. And the more you zoom in on these districts, you see where that dividing line is, right? So just as an example here, and this is just as an example, if I wanted or thought, or the community, someone who lives right on this street here, which is this is 94th Street off of 37th Avenue, right? If someone who lived right over here says, you know what, my issues are not issues, of the adjoining district here. My issues kind of, align more with the parts in the Corona seat, right, which is centered around the density of Corona. And that person from there may choose to want to be incorporated into District 21 because that person, that voter, feels that their issues will be best represented by someone within a district that has more similarities than the ones that they're currently being represented by in the adjoining district. Sometimes this one may not be as clear as day, right? Because we do see the density of Latinos, and sometimes going more dense on Latinos kind of diminishes the power of an electorate like the Latino community. But this is just one example. The person living on that street can testify at a series of hearings that are upcoming and basically make their case for why they believe that their vote is being diluted by being in a district that is not the one that they feel they'd be best represented in, right? So, with a combination of numbers and a combination of demographic understanding and geography, as a voter, as a person who lives in these communities, that's enough intel that that the New York City Districting Commission needs to hear from their electorate, right? I wanna add that, in places, let's say, like District 34, right, where Williamsburg, and if you look at District 34 as an example, it's not a surprise that the community in Williamsburg has, been gentrified, as well as parts of Bushwick, and it's been slowly changing through the decades, right? We've seen this in the last couple of, we saw the conversation around the Nydia Velasquez seat, right? And the changing demographics of parts of this district. Currently this district, and this is where you find some of the numbers that are relevant to the conversation. The average district size is 172,000 people. This district, in order to get to that ideal size, because its current size is 167,000 people, it needs to add 5,770 people. And folks are like, well, what do you mean? How do you add? Well, literally, you would take mapping software, which is completely open source, and you would pick at a block and you would add it into this magic blue dark line would move over and capture a new block, right? And then the numbers over here would tally all up, And this is exactly the process by which the New York City, not independent, well, I guess it kind of is independent. Well, not really. The New York City Districting Commission, which is made up of 15 members of the city council, would have to, in fact, draw a map to balance out these needs. Now, as an example, from what I heard in parts of the area between District 34 and 37, there is a community called Hope Gardens, and I want to literally say that it's around here in Linden. And if I zoom in, you can see streets and you can see street numbers. But from what I hear, there is a community district that is on the outskirts of the community that it services in District 37. And so one of the community arguments is they need to bring this blue line south in order to be able to capture the totality of a housing complex and the community center that it represents, called Hope Gardens. So that's just one example, right, of a conversation that is taking place around the parts of northern Brooklyn. Then there's a huge surge, and I think it's important for us to highlight this. District 33, and when folks can see the shape of District 33, District 33 has seen an increase in over 34,988 people. That's 35,000 people more than what the district should have after the 2020 census. So we have to redraw the seat in order to remove 35,000 people. And the question is, where? Who gets removed from District 33? And who does it give it to, right, in terms of neighboring districts, in order for that district to be legally standing at 172,000, give or take a couple of hundred, if not a couple of thousand people. I want to also highlight, and that's not a Latino district, right? Let's just clearly highlight that this is a 66.9% white voting age population. That means over the age of 18 district. The other district that we've seen very large population increase is District 3, the district of Eric Botcher. That saw an average increase in population of 29,000, almost 30,000 people in this district. All that to say that the only way in which some of these districts can move are limited, right? This district cannot move population to the west because we're in New Jersey, right? It can move perhaps population south into District 1, but District 1 has to get rid of itself 11,000 people. And what I mean by getting rid of, right, it needs to move those populations in other parts. So essentially, we're talking about a northern, or even maybe going into Brooklyn or going into Staten Island and giving a population where it gives. But I think it's critical for folks to understand that this is a meticulous, detailed, process that requires public input, right? And this is a site that I think folks, if you just Google New York City Districting Commission, well, folks can get on here and find out ways that they can participate. They can really, if you go under the participate button, the next hearing is happening tomorrow at Ostos Community College. Usually it's between the times of 4 and 7, but you can absolutely register online. Then there'll be a second hearing July 7th. If you reach out to critica.nyc@gmail.com, we'd be more than happy to answer your questions about, what to talk about. But at the start of this page, there's actually a primer, something that gives you an explanation as to why then this needs to happen and ways for folks to engage. So, I'm going to leave it at that because I could only imagine, how much, folks are like, I just can't, right? There's just a lot of information that happens to me in these areas, but it's going to impact districts for the next 10 years. It happened to us in the state Senate and Assembly and Congressional when we redrew. And for folks to understand, like, city council is supposed to be, it's not the smallest district, Assembly is the smallest, but our leadership, essentially, our policymakers, they come from their neighborhoods. Their activity impacts the political landscape. The voices of those that show up to testify will impact the drawing of the political landscape by which all of us will be moving within in these next 10 years, right? And I don't know, for me, it's always been really fascinating, Eli, that every 10 years we have an opportunity to reshape, right? And kind of restart and have a conversation about who lives in the neighborhood and then get to work for the next 10 years, right? It's weird, but it feels like a redrawing and, capturing communities that perhaps have overgrown their seat, right? Or have shifted out because of whatever issues, and yet have similarities to the voters in a particular district that should be kept together. So that's, I think in a nutshell, if that's a nutshell, that's exactly what we're looking at. And I want to really encourage folks to participate. That's my spiel on it.
It's so important, so much at stake, and absolutely they should avail themselves of the resources that you mentioned precisely for that reason. I think it takes all of us together to really make an impact and just and just contribute with our voice, because this is all of us together, right? Living in the same space and living in the same space, and you see there's others that are living in your space too that want to share their voice. That's what we're talking about, But
I wish the community would bark as loud as the dog that hears the voices in the back, right? Then we wouldn't be really having this strenuous conversation around how to engage, how to turn folks out. It would be, I don't know, I kind of feel like it would be quite the entertaining, scenario if everyone was kind of like barking, right? Absolutely. I feel like, look, I'm all about conflict. I kind of feel like conflict brings about good conversation and resolution that will hopefully yield better educational attainments, better economic opportunities, social realities that are not the current ones that we're living in. So, I think we're going to definitely invite you back, Eli, so we can definitely have an analysis, of what's happened post-August primary. But just a quick highlight, folks, August 23rd. Try to shut us up. Make sure you turn out.
Yes, vote.
Yeah, that's going to be the critical thing. And, vote early. So thank you so much, Eli, for joining us.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you.
Bye.